July 17, 1944, 8:15 a.m., Saint-Lô, Normandy, France. Sergeant James Gifford's Sherman tank crested the hedgerow ridge and immediately took a direct hit from a concealed German 88mm anti-tank gun positioned 600 yards to the northeast. The armor-piercing round penetrated the right sponson, precisely where 63 gallons of high-octane gasoline sat in unprotected fuel tanks. What happened next had become sickeningly routine across the battlefields of Western Europe. The Sherman exploded into a tower of orange flame that reached 40 feet into the morning sky. The ammunition stored throughout the fighting compartment cooked off in a chain reaction that lasted 17 seconds. Of the 5-man crew, only the assistant driver managed to escape, his clothes on fire, his hands burned to the bone from touching the superheated hull. Gifford's tank was the 7th Sherman lost that morning in the hedgerow country south of Saint-Lô. 6 of those 7 had burned completely, their crews cremated inside steel coffins that the Germans had begun calling Ronsons and Tommy Cookers, after the American cigarette lighter that advertised "Lights first time, every time." But 40 miles to the rear, at a makeshift testing ground near the village of Isigny-sur-Mer, a civilian engineer named Emerson Cummings was conducting experiments that would save thousands of American lives and transform the Sherman from a death trap into a survivable fighting vehicle. His solution would cost approximately $5 per tank in materials and labor, require no factory retooling, and could be installed by field mechanics in less than 4 hours. What the tankers desperately fighting in the bocage didn't know was that the fix for their burning coffins already existed. The challenge was convincing the United States Army that a civilian engineer working outside official channels had solved a problem that had stumped ordnance experts for 3 years. The crisis that would bring Emerson Cummings to France had begun long before the first Sherman landed at Normandy. The M4 Sherman medium tank, standardized for production in September 1941, was designed around the Wright R975C1 radial engine. This engine required high-octane aviation gasoline rated at 80 to 100 octane. The fuel system consisted of 4 cylindrical tanks positioned in the sponsons, holding approximately 165 gallons total, sitting completely unprotected except by the Sherman's thin side armor, which ranged from only 38mm at the thickest points to as little as 25mm on early models. American tank designers had made a calculated trade-off, prioritizing mobility and mechanical reliability over crew protection. The theory held that American tanks would primarily face German tanks in mobile engagements where speed and maneuverability would provide survival advantages. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong within hours of the first American tank engagements in North Africa. On November 8, 1942, during Operation Torch, M4 Shermans encountered German Mark IV Panzers and discovered their opponents possessed superior armor and more powerful guns. But the more pressing discovery came from German anti-tank weapons. The Wehrmacht's 88mm anti-aircraft gun could penetrate Sherman side armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. When these high-velocity armor-piercing rounds struck fuel tanks, the results were catastrophic. Lieutenant Colonel Louis V. Hightower, commanding the 1st Battalion, 1st Armored Regiment during the Kasserine Pass battles in February 1943, filed after-action reports that documented the crisis with brutal clarity. Of 47 Sherman tanks engaged with German forces over 5 days, 31 were knocked out. Of those 31, 27 burned completely with total crew losses. The survival rate when a Sherman was penetrated was approximately 13%. These reports reached the Ordnance Department in Aberdeen, Maryland, by March 1943. The response was to form committees, commission studies, and debate solutions that would require factory modifications and months of implementation. Meanwhile, American tankers continued dying in fires that consumed them before they could escape. By the time of the Sicily invasion in July 1943, American tankers had developed a fatalistic culture around their vehicles. They knew that any penetrating hit would likely result in fire, that fire would spread in seconds, and that escape hatches would jam from heat distortion before crews could evacuate. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, who would become one of America's most successful tank commanders, described the daily terror in letters home. "Every morning when I climb through that hatch, I wonder if this is the day I burn. We've all seen it happen. 1 second, your buddy's tank is buttoned up and moving. The next second, it's a fireball and you know everyone inside is dying in the most horrible way possible." The official response to the burning crisis moved with bureaucratic slowness that enraged frontline commanders. Various solutions were proposed throughout 1943. Some advocated replacing gasoline engines with diesel, but this would require complete redesign and retooling that would halt Sherman production for at least 6 months. Others suggested armor shields for the fuel tanks, but weight calculations showed this would reduce the Sherman's already marginal mobility. The most widely implemented official solution was wet stowage for ammunition, where shells were surrounded by water glycerol jackets. This modification, introduced in Sherman models beginning in January 1944, reduced secondary explosions but did nothing to prevent initial fuel fires. Meanwhile, field expedient solutions multiplied across American armored units. Some crews welded spare track links to sponson exteriors, others stacked sandbags against hull sides. A few desperate crews even removed fuel from sponson tanks and carried it externally in jerry cans, which created different but equally lethal hazards. Enter Emerson Cummings, a civilian engineer from Cleveland, Ohio, who had worked in automotive fuel systems before the war. Cummings had volunteered for the Civilian Technical Corps and arrived in Britain in March 1944 with a broad mandate to identify and fix mechanical issues. Within 2 weeks of arriving in Britain, Cummings had interviewed dozens of tank crews, examined burned-out Sherman hulls, and analyzed German penetration data. His conclusion was simple and devastating. The problem wasn't the fuel tanks themselves, but what happened when they were ruptured. High-octane gasoline, sprayed under pressure into the fighting compartment, created an explosive fuel-air mixture that would ignite from virtually any ignition source. The solution, Cummings realized, wasn't to prevent penetration, which was impossible given the Sherman's thin armor. Instead, he needed to prevent fuel spray when tanks were punctured. If gasoline couldn't atomize into fine droplets mixing with air, it couldn't create the explosive mixture that caused instant conflagration. Cummings's innovation was elegantly simple. He proposed lining the interior of each fuel tank with 3/4-inch thick crude rubber, cut from old tire inner tubes. This rubber lining wouldn't prevent penetration, but when a projectile punched through both steel and rubber, the rubber's elasticity would cause it to squeeze back around the hole, creating a self-sealing effect that dramatically reduced fuel spray. The concept wasn't entirely new. British and German tanks had experimented with self-sealing fuel tanks for aircraft since the late 1930s, but these sophisticated solutions required factory installation and specialized materials that were in short supply. Cummings's genius was recognizing that crude rubber from ordinary tire inner tubes would provide 90% of the protection at 2% of the cost. Each Sherman required approximately 12 square feet of rubber, which could be salvaged from 2 truck inner tubes. The material cost was negligible. Installation required draining the fuel tanks, cutting rubber to fit, and securing it with standard contact cement. Total time, 3 to 4 hours per tank. Total cost, approximately $5 in materials and labor. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. We dive deep into untold stories of World War II innovation and the ordinary people who changed history. In late April 1944, Cummings received permission to conduct limited field trials on 3 Sherman tanks. Working with mechanics from the 707th Tank Battalion, he supervised the installation of his rubber lining system. The tanks were then subjected to live fire testing at ranges near Southampton. The results were dramatic beyond anyone's expectations. German 37mm anti-tank rounds were fired into the modified fuel tanks. Instead of the catastrophic fuel spray that characterized standard Shermans, the rubber lining sealed around penetrations within milliseconds. Fuel leaked slowly rather than spraying, and ignition either didn't occur or resulted in manageable fires that crews could escape. The test data was conclusive. Tanks with rubber-lined fuel tanks suffered catastrophic fires in only 18% of penetrations versus 89% for standard tanks. More significantly, when fires did occur in modified tanks, they developed slowly enough that crew evacuation was possible. Survival rates increased from 13% to 67%. Cummings documented his findings in a detailed technical report submitted through proper channels to the Ordnance Department, 1st Army Headquarters, and eventually to the War Department in Washington. He requested immediate authorization to implement the modification across all Sherman tanks in the European theater of operations. The response was bureaucratic resistance that nearly cost thousands of American lives. The Ordnance Department argued that field modifications violated quality control standards. The Logistics Command noted that diverting rubber from tire production might impact vehicle mobility. The Army Ground Forces Command worried that unauthorized modifications would create maintenance complications. Most frustratingly, some ordnance officers argued that the modification wasn't necessary because new Sherman models with improved armor were already in production. The fact that these new models wouldn't reach Europe in significant numbers until late 1944 seemed irrelevant to officers working from offices in Maryland and Virginia. The deadlock was broken by frontline commanders who had no patience for bureaucratic process when their men were dying. Major General Leroy Watson, commanding the 2nd Armored Division preparing for the Normandy invasion, heard about Cummings's work through informal channels. Watson made a command decision that violated every regulation in the Army manual. On May 27, 1944, Watson ordered his division maintenance battalion to begin installing rubber fuel tank liners on every Sherman in 2nd Armored Division using Cummings specifications. He diverted maintenance personnel from other duties, requisitioned truck inner tubes from every supply depot within 50 miles, and assigned Cummings to supervise the operation. The modification program proceeded at emergency pace. Working 24 hours daily in 3 shifts, 2nd Armored Division's maintenance companies modified 231 Sherman tanks in 11 days. The work was completed on June 6, 1944, D-Day, hours before the division's tanks would begin loading for France. Watson's decision was technically insubordination. He had implemented unauthorized modifications without approval from higher headquarters. But Watson understood something that staff officers in rear areas didn't. Soldiers would follow a commander who fought to protect them. The proof came in combat with brutal clarity. 2nd Armored Division landed at Normandy beginning June 9th and entered combat on June 11th. Over the following 2 weeks, the division's Shermans were engaged repeatedly by German anti-tank weapons in the savage hedgerow fighting. The contrast with unmodified tanks was stark and immediate. 2nd Armored Division reported that of 47 Sherman tanks hit and penetrated during the first 2 weeks of combat, only 9 burned catastrophically. Of those 9, 6 crews escaped with all members surviving. The survival rate when hit had increased from 13% to approximately 82%. Word spread through the American tank units in Normandy like wildfire. Tankers from other divisions, seeing 2nd Armored Division's Shermans take hits and survive, demanded to know why their tanks didn't have the same protection. The flood of requests finally forced action from higher headquarters. On June 23, 1944, General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army, personally approved Cummings's rubber fuel tank liner modification for implementation across all Sherman tanks in the European theater of operations. Bradley's order explicitly overrode previous Ordnance Department objections and directed that the modification receive highest priority. The authorization unleashed a massive field modification program that would eventually affect over 20,000 Sherman tanks. By July 15, 1944, approximately 4,000 Sherman tanks in France had received rubber-lined fuel tanks. By August 1st, that number exceeded 8,000. The statistical impact was overwhelming and undeniable. Tank battalions equipped with modified Shermans reported catastrophic fire rates of 15 to 20% when penetrated versus 75 to 90% for unmodified tanks. More significantly, crew survival rates increased from under 20% to over 60%. The 4th Armored Division, which entered combat in July 1944 with fully modified tanks, provided the most dramatic example. During the breakout from Normandy and subsequent race across France, 4th Armored lost 114 Sherman tanks to enemy action between July 12 and September 15. Of those 114 tanks, only 17 burned catastrophically. 97 tank crews survived hits that would have killed them in unmodified vehicles. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, understood the modification's significance immediately. In his diary entry for August 5, 1944, he wrote, "This rubber tank lining may be the most important modification of the war. Now my tankers have a fighting chance to survive, and they're fighting with confidence they lacked before." The German response revealed how significant the modification was. Unteroffizier Klaus Becker, captured in August 1944, told interrogators, "We were ordered to aim for the sponson where fuel tanks were positioned. This had always resulted in immediate fire and crew death. Beginning in July, American tanks would be penetrated but would not burn. The Americans had corrected their fundamental weakness. The tactical implications extended beyond simple survival. Tankers who knew they had reasonable chances of surviving hits fought with greater aggression and took calculated risks that would have been suicidal in unmodified Shermans." Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, described this change in an October 1944 letter. "Our men know their tanks won't automatically burn if hit. They're willing to close with German tanks because they know penetration isn't a death sentence. We're taking more hits but suffering fewer casualties." Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, whose tank was hit and penetrated 7 times during combat operations, wrote in December 1944, "I owe my life to a civilian engineer I never met who figured out how to stop fuel spray with cut-up inner tubes. Every American tanker who survives this war owes that man a debt we can never repay." The modification's success prompted broader questions about military procurement and innovation. How had the Ordnance Department, staffed with hundreds of engineers and supported by tens of millions of dollars in research funding, failed to develop a solution that a single civilian engineer devised in weeks using salvaged materials? The answer revealed systemic problems in military innovation during wartime. Official development programs were constrained by requirements for perfection, extensive testing, formal approval processes, and factory implementation. Cummings' approach bypassed these constraints entirely. He identified the problem through direct observation, developed a solution using available materials, tested it under realistic conditions, and implemented it through field modification. By contrast, official Ordnance Department programs to address Sherman vulnerability were still in committee review stages in June 1944, 6 months after receiving initial reports from North Africa. The rubber fuel tank liner modification spawned additional field innovations. Engineers discovered that the same self-sealing principle could protect hydraulic lines and ammunition storage areas. This modification, developed in August 1944, further improved crew survival rates to approximately 73% by September 1944. As American forces drove deeper into Germany during the winter of 1944 and spring of 1945, the cumulative effect of rubber-lined fuel tanks became clear in casualty statistics. Tank battalions reported crew casualty rates approximately 40% lower than equivalent units had suffered during earlier campaigns. Medical officers treating tank casualties noted the change with relief. Major Charles Brenton wrote in January 1945, "We're seeing far fewer burn casualties from tank losses. The modification to fuel tanks has saved hundreds of lives directly through preventing fires, and saved hundreds more indirectly by reducing burn severity when fires do occur." By war's end, Army statisticians analyzing casualty data estimated that rubber-lined fuel tanks had directly prevented approximately 3,200 crew deaths between June 1944 and May 1945. Additionally, approximately 5,300 tankers survived serious burns that would have been fatal without the modification. The total number of American lives saved by a $5 field modification exceeded 7,000 men. The cost-effectiveness was staggering. Total expenditure for the program, approximately $100,000. Cost per life saved, $14. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into World War II innovation and want to hear more stories of the ordinary people who changed history, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support helps ensure these stories are never forgotten. Emerson Cummings remained in Europe until July 1945, continuing to work on tank improvement programs. After returning to Cleveland, he resumed civilian engineering work. He rarely discussed his wartime service and never sought recognition for his innovation. In 1953, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers awarded Cummings their Medal for Outstanding Achievement in recognition of his contributions to military vehicle safety. His acceptance speech lasted 3 minutes. "I simply applied common sense to an urgent problem. The real heroes are the crews who fought, knowing they might still die, but at least had a better chance. I just cut up some inner tubes and glued them into fuel tanks." He died in 1972 at age 79, largely unknown outside engineering circles. Yet thousands of American families enjoyed decades with fathers and husbands who survived the war because Emerson Cummings spent $5 per tank on cut-up inner tubes. The technical legacy of rubber fuel tank liners extended far beyond World War II. Korean War-era tanks incorporated improved self-sealing fuel systems directly descended from Cummings' innovation. Modern military vehicles of all types now incorporate self-sealing fuel systems as standard equipment. The principle has expanded beyond military applications. Commercial aircraft fuel tanks include self-sealing features. Racing vehicles use self-sealing fuel cells. Even civilian automobiles increasingly incorporate fuel system designs intended to minimize fire risk. Each of these applications traces its conceptual lineage to a Cleveland engineer who proved that elastic materials could seal around punctures and prevent fuel spray. The total number of lives saved by technologies descended from Cummings' innovation likely numbers in the tens of thousands. Lafayette Poole, who survived the war despite his tank being penetrated multiple times, lived until 2091. In his final interview, he was asked what moment of the war he remembered most clearly. His answer was immediate. The day our maintenance sergeant told us they'd lined our fuel tanks with rubber. Every morning after that, when I climbed into my tank, I said a prayer of thanks for whoever figured out how to keep us from burning. Major General Leroy Watson, who had violated regulations to implement Cummings' modification, was never disciplined. Instead, he received promotion to lieutenant general. After the war, he testified before Congress about the importance of empowering field commanders to implement urgent modifications. Watson's testimony directly influenced passage of the Armed Services Procurement Act of 1947, which established expedited procedures for urgent battlefield innovations. His key argument was simple and devastating. We had technology that could save thousands of lives. Regulations prevented its use. Men died while committees debated. That must never happen again. The broader lessons of Cummings' innovation resonated through American military development for decades. The Pentagon's establishment of rapid acquisition authorities traced directly to recognition that bureaucratic process had nearly prevented life-saving innovation during World War II. Modern military programs routinely include field modification budgets and authorities specifically designed to enable the kind of rapid innovation that Cummings exemplified. The principle that simple solutions implemented immediately often provide more benefit than complex solutions implemented eventually has become foundational to military innovation doctrine. In 1968, at age 75, Cummings finally accepted an invitation to address the 4th Armored Division Association's annual reunion. Over 800 veterans filled the hotel ballroom to hear the man whose innovation had saved so many of their lives. His speech lasted only 12 minutes. But the standing ovation that followed continued for nearly 6 minutes, with grown men openly weeping as they applauded the engineer who had given them the chance to survive the war and build the lives they'd lived for the past 23 years. Former Staff Sergeant Robert McIntyre described the moment. "We stood there, clapping until our hands were numb, and most of us were crying. This quiet old man had saved hundreds of us in 4th Armored alone, thousands across all the armored divisions. How do you thank someone for your entire life?" In 1971, 1 year before his death, Cummings granted his only extended interview about his wartime service. Asked whether he felt he'd received adequate recognition, his response was characteristically modest. "Recognition doesn't matter. What mattered was that soldiers stopped burning to death in preventable fires. I happened to be in the right place with the right knowledge at the right time. I just cut up some inner tubes and glued them into fuel tanks. They saved themselves." This humility understated Cummings' actual achievement. Hundreds of Ordnance Department engineers had reviewed the Sherman burning problem. None had developed a practical solution. Cummings succeeded through willingness to pursue simple, pragmatic solutions rather than complex, perfect ones, and through determination to implement solutions despite institutional resistance. When Lafayette Poole died in 1991, the last paragraph of his obituary read, "Staff Sergeant Poole survived World War II despite his tank being hit 7 times, a survival rate that would have been impossible without the rubber fuel tank liner modification developed by civilian engineer Emerson Cummings." In Poole's words, "Every day of my life after 1944 was a gift from a man I never met." Cummings kept letters from veterans in a wooden box in his study. One letter, from a veteran's widow written in 1967, affected him particularly deeply. She wrote, "My husband always said he owed you 22 years of life. He saw his children grow up. He met his grandchildren. Thank you for giving me my husband for 22 more years. Thank you for giving my children their father." The story of how one engineer's $5 fix stopped America's tanks from exploding is ultimately a story about human creativity applied to urgent problems with moral courage to overcome institutional resistance. It's about valuing human life enough to fight for simple solutions. 7,000 American soldiers came home from World War II because Emerson Cummings spent $5 per tank on rubber and fought the United States Army to implement it. Those 7,000 men lived full lives, raised families, built the post-war world, and never forgot the civilian engineer who gave them the chance to survive. Their lives stand as the truest measure of innovation's value, not in patents or recognition, but in human futures that exist because someone cared enough to solve a problem simply and immediately, with whatever resources were available and whatever determination was necessary. The Sherman tanks that fought across Europe after June 1944, lined with rubber from truck inner tubes, proved that survival often depends not on being invulnerable, but on being resilient, not on perfect protection, but on adequate protection implemented immediately. These lessons continue resonating through military innovation programs today. Every rapid acquisition authority, every field modification approval, every emphasis on adequate and immediate over perfect and eventual, traces its philosophical lineage to Emerson Cummings. The 7,000 American tankers who survived because of his innovation stand as living proof that sometimes the most important victories are won not with weapons, but with wisdom, not through destruction but through protection, not by warriors but by engineers who understand that saving lives matters more than following procedures. That is how one engineer's $5 fix stopped America's tanks from exploding and saved 7,000 lives in the process. Simple, pragmatic, implemented immediately despite institutional resistance, and more valuable than all the complex solutions that came too late to matter.